How I love that music. This is so pumped up for a Friday.
I'm just glad it's Friday, personally.
Wait, it's Friday. I didn't realize that.
Although I don't really feel it's Friday because I'm gonna have to work either tomorrow or Sunday to play catch up. So.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about that later on, but I think most people is coming to hear from Efficacy, right? Talking about efficacy of secure architectures. And I'm all ready to dive into the discussion. I don't know if we're going to play. I have my espresso as well. So
I've got cold brew.
I'm ready. I'm ready for it. And I just posted something on Twitter. It's a poll. I know it's just a few options, but I asked this question: how do you measure the efficacy of your secure architectures? And how do you feel about this option? PCI audits. That's one. The other one is purple teaming exercises.
I don't like any of your options.
But I think there's more options, right? For example, you could measure the efficacy post-mortem, like after you had a breach.
Oh, that's great, because that's when you get more money. And then either problems get solved or you cause more problems by buying tool after tool after tool because you're not measuring. And even if like if I'm being honest, like I'm in my company, I'm not the person who does the measuring. My business partner does it. And I'm the one that usually challenges, hey, do we really need to measure all those things? Because at some point, I just trust my staff that they're doing like they're doing their job right. I don't know if you've seen like the Penguins show with your kids, like where they're eating the cheesy nibbles and like it just feels right. And then pause for maximum coolness, and you just feel it.
Yeah, you just feel it. I don't think that's a good answer. Sorry.
But I think like from your thing, PCI audits and purple teaming, I feel like auditing in general is standard practice because you meet it or you're not. It's kind of easier to measure. But like the purple teaming, I'm a huge fan of purple teaming. I don't know necessarily if that's always the right way to measure how well you're doing, though, either. I think it's an important step in maturity. But if that's the only way we can measure how well we're doing, then I don't know.
Let's start by, before we get into the how, right? Before we get into the different ways. And I'm looking at the comments from everybody. So thank you for that. Let's make this interactive. That's how we like to do it, right?
And I agree with you, by the way. Purple Team's way better than PCI audits.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are better than PCI audits, right? But let's say this before. Is this something that anybody here in the audience is actually looking at, like how to measure efficacy of your secure architectures? And if so, what are you using today, right? So we can bring that into the discussion. We can incorporate it. Because what I see is that we typically look at efficacy of point-in-time solutions. For example, traditionally, right, we have had all of these AV comparatives and all of these different reports that look at the efficacy of an antivirus, the efficacy of your, I'm going to call it endpoint solution. And efficacy, it's measured in terms of, did you block the malware or you did not block it, right? So, we had 100% efficacy. You blocked the malware 100% of the times. Great. But how useful is that today when, the malware, it's sometimes dropped at the end of the attack chain? And I'm thinking of many of the ransomware attacks that we have seen lately. And, we don't have to mention names. We have seen all of this news in the last few years, and the attack the ransomware payload is just the last thing that happens at the end of the attack chain. So if you look at the efficacy of your antivirus or endpoint solution or EDR detecting and blocking that, it's too late, right? So to me, what I'm really interested in is how you measure the efficacy of your secure architecture that should help you to not only prevent, but also detect and react to that as soon as possible in the attack chain. How is anybody doing this? Wow, we have people from Paris, from Bolivia. That's awesome. Brazil, Costa Rica.
From everywhere.
From a taxi in Netherlands. Oh my goodness, I hope you're not driving. Yeah.
Hey, if you are, that's called passion.
And if you are, be safe. Okay, so Christopher says, I'm an auditor. All we are allowed to do Something about that's classified. Oh, come on, just tell us the classified stuff. That's what we want to know.
Well, and I think maybe we should start with, how do you define success? Because how do you measure something that helps you get to success? Like, what's the criteria for success? Is it never being compromised? Because that's not realistic. Is it trying to block a breach? Is it meeting stakeholder, making stakeholders happy, but not necessarily trying to be secure?
Well, that's an important measure of success, like managing your manager. Yes, that's important. Well, I'm going to throw something in there. I think that efficacy cannot be measured in just one single way. I think you have to break it down into capabilities. So, for example, for protection, efficacy obviously is, how many of these malicious activities were you able to block, right? That's something easy to understand. But in terms of, for example, detection, efficacy could be, how fast you can detect a malicious activity, how much coverage you have for specific TTPs, and maybe you can use a Mitre attack matrix as a reference for that. In terms of efficacy in response, obviously you're talking about time as well. How fast can you respond? And how comprehensive is that response? Like, for example, maybe you want to reboot a system at some point. Maybe you want to kill a process, or maybe you want to take some evidence for later investigation. Investigations is part of that as well, right? How do you measure efficacy in an investigation? Then we will have to talk about how fast can you collect evidence and analyze evidence, and can you pivot across different type of evidence and correlate it.
So what I'm hearing in parts, like, I like the measuring over time, because then you can show improved or decrease. But what I'm also hearing is a measurement on whether or not you actually have achieved a capability. Like, one thing I'm a big fan of is you could have the biggest, shiny, best of breed, magic quadrant, top right corner product, but if you're not actually using it, is that really a capability? Like, if it's default tuned and doesn't really do anything, it's a capability you have, but you're not actually consuming. Therefore, I argue you don't actually have it. And what I'm hearing, part of what you're saying, is you could measure, like, hey, can I correlate these data sources together? That's actually a yes or no data point, and that sounds really basic, but over time your system could actually malfunction and it doesn't work. And so stuff that's really basic, unless we continuously assess that, you might not actually have that capability. Like the purple team frameworks, and I know purple team for me is not the only way to measure success, but Atomic Red, Caldera, Infection Monkey, the commercial equivalents, like, you could run those every single day, and not only do they let you know, did you see it, did you not, did you prevent it, did you detect it, but what if the results changed from today till tomorrow? Like, today you catch it, but tomorrow for whatever reason you don't. Because very rarely do we ever do that kind of continuous assessment. And so, like, I remember a Magic Quadrant, the #1 IDS in the world, according to Gartner, top right corner, and their signatures were malfiring and couldn't catch standard brute force passwords for about a month due to a signature update. And nobody knew unless you were testing it. And so, like, we found it and we're like, this is a really simple rule. Why is it not working? Hey, why is this still not working? 2 weeks. What's going on? Get a developer on the line, a month, and we finally got it fixed. It's like, but people are paying for that coverage and they didn't notify anybody.
So essentially what you're saying is that efficacy should not be measured like a yes or no, but more like it's not that much like digital as it is analog, right? We need to look at a range of values.
I think it's like anytime you measure, some things are, I think, yes or no, and I'm fine with those. But sometimes it should be yes or no on a daily. Like, I definitely feel certain things need to be a daily yes or no. But I'm personally also a fan of qualitative, because even like in 530 and 555, we do the MITRE detect, and we do MITRE. attack and we do like the threats against an industry, I mean, while that seems kind of black and white, that's also, to me, that's still a qualitative assessment because it's an objective. Yes, it's based on known techniques, but there's also a bunch of unknown techniques, and so maybe you think you're good, but maybe you're not. But to me, it's like it's a base standard. If we know that healthcare gets hit with these attacks, retail gets hit with these attacks, and you're in one of those industries and you don't even have basic coverage of those known attacks against your industry, I do think that's a good measurement point of maybe I need to buy prevention and detection and response capabilities based on these known factors.
Yep.
I don't know. Where do you sit on this one, Ismael? Like, I feel like you should at first start with the basics, the knowns, before you really grow up to be able to handle the know thyself unknowns, even though I feel we actually catch more in that space personally, but you don't really do a good job at this unknown know thyself space until you first do the basics.
Yeah, it's like some sort of baseline, right? I think one of the someone in the audience was mentioning this, that you need some sort of a baseline, because otherwise, you're going to measure something, but what do you compare against? So that's a very good starting point. So yes, to talk about something specific, as you mentioned in 5:30, we start with the threat modeling exercise based on Mitre attack, and we look at a measure of efficacy in terms of detection, meaning how much coverage you have, right, and visibility. So if you don't have anything else to start with, let's start with measuring how much visibility you have in your environment. That's efficacy at the end of the day, right? So even with that visibility, you can look at things like coverage. You're not going to have the same coverage across the entire organization. Like, for example, do you have visibility of PowerShell? Well, what type of PowerShell, right? Can you see PowerShell script logs? Where do you see those? Do you see them on just workstations or workstations and servers?
So Ismael,
I'm going down to the weeds now.
just to like poking Ismael's buttons, and really, I love that you guys are all commenting so much. So like, but you said PowerShell, and that just immediately brings my mind to, but how do people measure what they don't know? Because like PowerShell, there's module logging, script block logging, transcription logging, geo-logging. There's the engine channel, there's the core channel, and it even exists on Linux in most of those factors. But that's like 6 or 7 things, and which one's the right one? And like script block logging, you said that, so whoop, right? But what if it's PowerShell within Notepad from DLL injection, so it's PowerShell outside? How is everybody supposed to know all of these different criteria, and therefore how do you measure what you don't know? Is the question, like, are we saying, kind of a self push of, hey, you need to come take Sec 530 and Sec 555, and otherwise you're just sorry? Because I hope that's not the answer, even though I'll take the money.
Well, I mean, that's what we teach, right, in these classes. But no, I mean, all the information that we use in the class, it's out there, right? What we show is the process, right? And based on our experience. And I feel that you're going back to my point before, that I think purple teaming exercises, even though they're not perfect, they are a really good way of measuring efficacy. So, for example, this is what I would do. You go to the Mitre attack matrix and you do some of this threat modeling, or just look at the attack navigator, right? What are the attackers that are hitting my industry? You mentioned it before. Okay, so I'm going to focus on, Wizard Spider and all of these that we see like regularly hitting people with ransomware. What are the TTPs that they use? Oh, you're going to see PowerShell. Awesome. But let's be more specific, please. What are the type of PowerShell, procedures are you going to be seeing? And if you look at these threat intelligence reports that Mitre will link to, and the blog posts are coming, and you're going to see a lot of these different implementations of that. But I'm gonna share some secret here, right? That nobody's listening right now. If you really want to nail this down, what you need to focus on is on understanding what are the tools that attackers are using. And I'll tell you something. 90% something of the attacks that we see these days, you know what type of PowerShell we're seeing? Cobalt Strike, right? Cobalt Strike beacons, obfuscated PowerShell, beaconing out, reaching out to the internet, and doing command and control. And then you see all the injection and the name pipes and all that stuff. But anyways, all of that is documented out there. It's not secret. All you need is to understand how attackers are doing these attacks. You have that information to start with in the Mitre Attack website. And then how they implement it. And the way they implement it is by using tools. And they're using the same tools that red teamers are using today. They're using the same tools that you can download from GitHub, right? Or get from other places. And, Cobalt Strike is not free. It's not open source. But just search around, right? and look for how attackers are using this and try to replicate it. That's when, purple teaming exercises become very useful, because now you're going to rehearse a very specific technique. And then you can realize of all of these things you're missing. Do I have visibility of that? Oh, no. Do I know when PowerShell is reaching out outbound? No, I don't see this. Right? And now this is how you determine, okay, this is my baseline. This is where I start. This is the next thing I need to do. You measure that. You're increasing your efficacy.
Yeah. Well, and so I shared my screen, but I don't know, Steven, if this shows up or if you have to put this up there.
Yep.
There we go.
I can see it now.
There we go. A lot of this stuff is completely free, but one of the things I'm kind of going back towards is you kind of have to know where to look. And so that's why I like doing these free live streams or webcasts. This is Mitre Detect. I'll zoom this in just a little bit. It's not technically a Mitre sponsored tool. It's just a project out on GitHub, and it goes through and it allows you to map what data sources give you the greatest visibility, and you can actually dump out data sources by number of Mitre techniques covered. And so it's kind of interesting: command execution, process creation, file modification, network traffic. I mean, it's no wonder EDR people actually like it, because it actually focuses on things that matter. And Fernando, your statement, I find that to be absolutely true. The problem isn't that you just have a SIM. It's what the heck are you protecting? What are you looking at? And because I don't know how many people I engage, clients, that they just have tons and tons of logs. And I come in, I was like, why'd you collect those? What do you mean? We're trying to catch the bad guys. Yeah, but those data sources don't actually help you catch anything. And so I have to go through there and be like, I just had this conversation last week. They're like, oh yeah, we monitor our Microsoft Azure. It's like, are you doing Azure Monitor? You said you have ADFS. Are you getting your ADFS logs? How about the ADFS health check to Azure connection? Are you getting Office 365 Management API? Are you getting the Graph API? Are you getting MCAS? And the guy just what? It's like, oh, okay. So what you're telling me is you've got all your Windows logs. So if you authenticate from your machine to Azure, you can see it. But if I try to password spray Azure, you can't. Yes. Okay. Well, you might want to consider these data sources. And so there are a lot of online talks. Microsoft has some. There's the Mitre Detect. And then we've got a bunch of YouTube things out there that kind of help us figure out what matters. Purple team is kind of cool too, because then you have things like Atomic Red, which we keep saying Mitre. Mitre is not the end all be all, but quite frankly, it's fantastic because it's one of the best ways of saying you have coverage or not. And so you can go in and play with these for Windows, for Linux, for Mac. And then what I think Ismael and I are a fan of, and Ismael, you can correct me if you disagree, is I'm a huge fan of when I talk to clients, because it's not my environment, I go through and I do stuff like, well, here's the data sources you have right now. Like this would be standard Windows operating system logs. And if I were to just measure this, be like, well, your data source coverage is missing a whole bunch of things. Like there's not very much color here. If you were to add EDR or something like Sysmon, it would have flipped to something like this. And so then it'd be like, well, why should I, how many of you are like, should we deploy Sysmon or not? Well, just as a comparison, if you do, it would be B and not A. Here's all the data sources that Sysmon's going to get you. Oh, I didn't do the, see, Ishmael, I haven't done this exercise in a while. Select
You need to come to class. I'll teach you. I'll teach you how to do it.
You would. You would. Select annotated. I gotta give these a score, otherwise the trick doesn't work.
Yeah, it's very finicky. I sometimes I fail as well. Usually in live demos.
There we go. Let's try this again. See, all this color is something that Sysmon gave us that you didn't have with standard Windows logs or EDR, and I don't care which one's which, but this to me is a decision factor of should we have Sysmon? Like, does it actually matter? And I don't know about you, but clearly having all these extra coverages of known attacker techniques, that totally makes sense. But this is only one step. You got to take it a little bit farther, because data source or visibility, if you have the data but you're not doing anything with it, what's the point? And so one of the things we also like to do is we like to stack our actual detection or analytics against this. Oh, I just loaded the same thing. Sorry, it's right here. And this can be done also for your prevention or even your response controls, probably more so prevention. But there are ways you could start to measure this. And so now I could be like, all right, where do I have alerts, but I don't have the data to even alert off of? C, no, I need D and not C. D and not B, actually. So this would be funny. These are areas where I have alert rules, but I don't even have a data source, so there's no way they could ever fire. And so when you actually start to assess what you have, sometimes you'll find some really funny things. Like, that's cool, I put a detection rule in, but it can never fire. And yeah, and there's other ways we need to measure, like KPIs and stuff like that too. And so that just kind of what works. I do find that this style of mapping with Navigator, I feel like that absolutely works, because Navigator helps me figure out what targets my industry, what data sources do I have visibility into, what detection techniques map to those data sources. And if you take the time to do it, you also have which prevention techniques map against those techniques.
Absolutely. So, and you know, as some of the comments here were mentioning, how is this related to the pyramid of pain? Well, if you look at the pyramid of pain from David Bianco, you have the IOCs pretty much on the bottom, IPs, domains, hashes, things that are going to be very easy for an attacker to change. But you know, the whole Mitre philosophy, it's not really a matrix, right? It's a philosophy, is that we have to be more focused on the TTPs, the behaviors, the top of the pyramid. Well, that's what Justin was showing in Navigator. Those are the behaviors. The tactic is, what's the motivation? What's the intent? What is the attacker trying to do? Attacker wants to do lateral movement. Okay, well, how can the attacker do lateral movement? Then you have all the different techniques and sub-techniques. And then the procedure is the implementation. Now, that high-level analysis, that threat modeling, can give you that baseline, that starting point on how to measure your efficacy. But at the end of the day, you have to go a step, further, deeper. As Justin was saying before, how do you know the specific type of PowerShell you should be looking for? And that's what I was saying before. You can get a lot of that information by looking at the tools and what type of artifacts these tools create, how do they behave. So all of that should be part of your analysis. Let me show you, since Justin was showing off and sharing screen. I'm going to share my screen too. Look at that. Okay. So which one of my screens is going to be shared now? Who knows? Oh, okay, I can choose. That's good. All right. So now you can see my screen. Look at that. So I don't like GUIs. Sorry, I'm just going to go to the command line here. I'm going to show you a tool that is being created by a buddy of mine, coworker in my employer, Carlos Diaz. And we use this a lot internally to orient some of our purple teaming exercises, and also to slice and dice the Mitre attack matrix better. The tool is called Mitre Assistant, right? And I'm not trying to say that this is the way you do threat intelligence, because it's not. It's just a way of looking at the matrix, okay, and finding the information you're looking for from a command line. And you can export all of this into a CSV and then play with your spreadsheets. So, one of the things that I like about this is that you can ask this Mitre Assistant specific questions. Like, for example, while you were talking, I was running some queries here, so I had them prepared. For example, show me all the data sources. And now you can see all the data sources in one single view. And you can see that, for example, API monitoring is mentioned as a data source in 42 techniques, 64 sub-techniques. So this is another way of looking at the data and saying, well, I guess I should have API monitoring. Well, yes, but API monitoring can be very, very chatty. So what type of API monitoring, right? Most likely this is going to be provided by your EDR, but you could go, really deep with Sysmon if you want to and get a lot of this information, or if you know some coding, you can even get to some of these providers in Windows and get the data from there. So all the things you can do. You can also, for example, get information on specific threat actors. You could say something like, Fin6, right? Then get the information there on how Fin6 has behaved according to the data that we have in Mitre, right? So you see all the tactics, all the techniques, all the sub-techniques. But look at this. We also see the malware, or I like to call this more than malware, it's like weapons, right? The weapons and the tools that these groups have been using. Why is this interesting? Because if you focus on these tools, on understanding how they behave, now you can build better visibility, better detection for this. For example, if you add -C, you can get even more information. I'm going to zoom out. But you may not be able to read everything. But this is a nice layout of all the different tactics and techniques that Fin7 has been observed using across different platforms, not just Windows, but also Linux, and the tools that they have been using for that particular implementation. For example, for command and control, they would use this technique, internal proxy, and they would implement this with Cobalt Strike. And they will look at, you will have to look at these particular data sources to be able to detect this activity. With this tool, you can even search for a specific weapon here, or let's say Cobalt Strike. You will get a summary of where Cobalt Strike is being mentioned in the matrix. So it's mentioned in the context of all of these different adversaries, and these are all the techniques and sub-techniques. So with this information, I would do now more research on these particular techniques and sub-techniques, how they can be implemented with Cobalt Strike, and there's plenty of blogs out there that mention that. And even in the Mitre website, you can see a lot of these references. And now we'll take it to the practice, to the range, right? I will put some systems in my, it could be in Azure, it could be,
Ismael, we lose you? Uh-oh. You might get stuck with me.
Sorry, instead of clicking on stop sharing, I clicked on leave studio. That's not cool.
So you got a couple questions, Ismael. The tool, the Mitre Assistant, open source, where do they get it?
Open source. It's on GitHub. Let me just put the link here, Mitre Assistant, and our buddy Stephen is going to share it with us.
Yep. There we go.
Yeah. And what I was saying is that you get now this, you emulate it, right? And you put it on the, you put your tools on a range, on Azure or your home lab, and then you see what visibility you have, what detection you have, what reaction capabilities you have, and you start measuring. And that measurement could be in terms of time, could be in terms of coverage, it could be in terms of false positives, false negatives, and now you have something that you can quantify and you can continuously measure.
I like that you mentioned the whole false positive, false negative, even true positive measurement. because I see a lot of measuring being number of incidents. And the only thing I don't like with that is, so if you have no incidents, does that mean you're secure, or does that mean you're blind? If you have a whole bunch of incidents, is it because of false positives? Like, what's going on? Or are you literally just being attacked all the time? Or do your prevention controls need to be improved? Because I mean, we're focusing a lot of detection, but if you're getting incidents all the time, sounds to me like you need to tune some of your prevention stuff too. And it doesn't mean you're not going to have routine incidents. That measurement should be tied to other points. The problem is it's just a single data point. And that's some of the things I struggle with measurements, is you can measure just about anything, but I don't know how many times I've seen a measurement, and then when you go to interpret it, it's bias and it can be out of context. And
yes, but you know what? I'm going to throw something that it may not be. It may sound like a little bit like, wow, what are you saying here? This is not cool. But the reality is, it doesn't really matter that much to me how you measure it and whether it's more or less biased, as long as it helps you move in the right direction.
Sure.
So even if the metric is like it's not perfect, and
so what you're saying, as long as you're measuring and using it to find value, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. And not just finding value, but helping you to go to the next step, getting that funding, that support, that budget. I have walked into environments where a SOC, for example, was using like this complicated spreadsheet. They were pulling data from so many places. They had 2 people dedicated to this spreadsheet, and so many hours, so much time, so much effort. And then I looked at that. It's like, for how long have you been using this method? Oh, we've been working on this for the last 6 months. Like, what have you achieved with this? Right? So the efficacy of that team was like, close to zero, because they just spent so much time doing that. But what did you get out of this? Versus like, you could put something quickly together. It may not be very accurate. It may not be like, it might be biased, but you put it on a spreadsheet or you put it in a PowerPoint presentation, I don't care. But if you can make it actionable and you get something good out of it, it takes you to the next step in your maturity curve. That works.
Now, I'm gonna call out. So Fernando, you posted another thing, and I wanted to address it / slightly disagree with it. About most of the time, SIM solutions isn't a fix for security problems. We must know how the business works, where the data is, before we have the SIM solution. I think I'm hoping we agree and disagree in the same fashion, because I've seen multiple times where a lot of SIMs, they're just sitting there, a central place of data that you're ignoring, so they provide no value. Similar to, if a measurement is helping you find value, it's good. If it's not, it's worthless. If I look at like the attack kill chain or the Mitre techniques, a lot of them end up from workstations coming in. And so I've had organization after organization where I've dropped in a SIM, and day 1 or first week, we find things and we help them fix them, assuming we have the right data source. But I think where you're going, and I absolutely agree with this, is in our overall architecture, we tend to focus on umbrella concepts, where I want one solution that protects everything. Like technically like a next-gen firewall at the edge kind of provides a default security under everything under that umbrella. But if that's all you have, yet you have critical, you have domain controllers, you have Oracle databases, you have hypervisors, like we need to focus some things that are more data-centric. And even from a SIM, I think the default rules, if you have good data and good alerts, provide solid coverage. But if you have critical assets, and we all do, there should be additional layers and additional things we measure, like what security techniques are being applied to all assets versus critical assets. And that should be a different count. Ismael, do you have anything on that concept? Because I know we go a decent amount on zero trust, data centric versus overall.
Exactly, absolutely, and SIEM is still like such an undervalued product and technology, just because the expectations are usually wrong, right? We may have been told that, hey, just install SIEM and it's gonna be great. Just bring all the logs into SIEM, everything's gonna be fine. And that's not how you start. So back to what you mentioned before, Justin, you have to define what success means, and then look at, how can you get closer? Not perfect, right? You're never going to be perfect at this, but how can you be a bit better with the things that you already have? And SIEM is a fantastic tool if you bring the right data and you're looking at the right.
That you said that, because like 530, what do we mainly focus on in there? We try to focus on practical things you can do with stuff you already own. Like I keep saying SIEM because I like SIEM. That's my day job. But next gen firewall, every one of you owns one, I'm going to guess. NSM, a large chunk of you own some form of NSM, IDS, NDR. EDR solutions, Windows group policies, and there's a lot of things architecturally you can do with that you already have. But how do we tie that, Ismael, back to this whole concept of measurement? Because I think there are different measures you should put in place for critical assets versus everything.
Yes, you have to, I call this divide and conquer, right?
Divide and conquer?
Divide and conquer. You have to build this based on your on zones, right? On tiers. You can't just like get one measure for your entire environment. So for example, when you look at coverage, I would divide that by zones. How much coverage you have in terms of visibility in your DMZ. Because I'll tell you what, sometimes we just focus on, having the agents on the LAN, and how about your servers? Not only your servers are commonly an initial attack vector. Yes, we know that phishing is the main thing, right? But you would be surprised how many ransomware attacks we see these days where the first step is a vulnerable system that it's on the DMZ that's exposed. If you don't bring any logs, any visibility, you don't have EDR, you don't have any other agents on these boxes, what kind of visibility you have? The lights are off in your DMZ. And if it's not the DMZ, it's your domain controllers. These are the ultimate goal of the attacker because they want to get all the credentials, right? And move freely around the environment. Those are the keys of the kingdom. So if you don't have that visibility there, you have a problem as well. So yeah, totally agree with you. These measurements must be divided, right, by zone, and you have to focus on the critical systems first. That's my suggestion. Start small, then expand from there.
Well, and I think one thing I'm going to throw out too is I think we tend not to categorize our assets the way I think we should. And what I mean, like what critical control number one, right? Inventory of authorized and unauthorized hardware. But if I have that inventory, and let's say I have a database, a web server that accesses that database, a domain controller, right? These are three things that can have more impact if they're compromised. So what I expect to see on that asset, whether it's Excel, a CMDB, somewhere like for the web server, is the endpoint suite you're using more rule tuned for a web server? Or is it the same, like Ismael, you work at McAfee, so you know exactly where I'm going with this, right? Like if I'm rolling McAfee and I have HIPS and antivirus and all those, it should be tuned differently for that web server than it should be for a workstation.
Absolutely.
And yet what I usually see a measurement of is I have 10,000 machines. We have 9,980 that have McAfee installed. We're 99.8% successful. But all I'm hearing is default tune for everything you've got coverage. Show me what systems you've tuned it for. Like you have a WAF. Did you just do automatic learning mode, or did you actually fine tune it to that asset? And that's a different way you can measure. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You can't perfectly tune something, but default config tuned for specific service. To me, those are two different measurements, and it showcases that you put time and effort into that rollout, and you can report that up the chain and be like, hey, we rolled out EDR and these systems have the default tunes. we've done these servers more specifically because special functions that are more critical. And I feel like that's an important measurement that I often don't see. And when I do assessments, it's clear.
I see that mistake all the time, not just with SIEM. You mentioned WAF. I was on a call with somebody, some time ago. I was mentioning, well, I have a lot of false positives from my WAF, and how can we, make it a bit more, well, talking about efficacy, right? Efficient in terms of, and effective, right? In terms of false positives tuning. And I asked this question, so what's your architecture like? And so what he described was essentially that he had one WAF with one rule set, trying to protect like hundreds of different servers. And I asked him, like, okay, so what's the role of these servers? Oh, it's different, different roles, different departments, different use cases, different needs, different attack surface, different threats. Therefore, it requires a different type of, rule set or analytics or, signatures, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yep.
So yes, you cannot just pretend that you're going to put one system on your network that it's going to block and detect all attacks. It does not work like that. You need focus. So to share something specific, what I would suggest anybody here is that if you've never done this before, just start with this. Very simple. Think about a ransomware attack, because everybody is if I say a nation state like APT29 or APT1 or one of those, like, let's face it, not everybody's going to be a victim of a nation state. But ransomware, anybody can be a victim of that for many different reasons. So look at the few ransomware campaigns that we have seen. The dark side, all these Ryuk campaigns. Look at all of those and see how the steps across the attack chain are so common, and how the tools they use to get to the detonation in the last step are so common. Don't focus on the malware. That's the last step in the kill chain. Focus on what happens before. And you're going to look at, things that like call a strike, as I said before, maybe, things that you can use to emulate these behaviors. Metasploit, Empire, all these tool sets that are out there. Just rehearse something like that. If you have one asset on the DMC that is vulnerable and somebody was able to access it, or if somebody found leaked credentials on the dark web that would give access to a system that is open through RDP on the DMC. From there, what could the attacker do? How could they own the entire environment? Because that's going to happen before they detonate the ransomware. And that's what you want to detect, the precursors of that. Or if somebody gets phished and somebody has standard credentials from any of your domain users, how can they own your environment from there? Here's another tool, Bloodhound. I have seen this in some of the latest attacks that you have seen on the news. Check it out, Bloodhound. All of these tools are open source, or most of them. Most of them. And you can test them out. What will the attacker do, right? That's the best training you can have. Thinking red, acting blue, thinking like the attacker.
Yeah, one thing I want to throw out too, Francois, for your question, how do you measure that? And I know you threw that out when I was talking about like tuning rules to different assets. And I want to share some ways that I think scale really well. That we just tend to kind of ignore the fact. Like, I'm going to go back to, let's just say we're McAfee deployed, because I want to make Ismael feel happy. Let's say you had 10,000 assets and you had default tune rules, but then you had different policies that were more tailored to web servers or so on. If you have that, you could create a manual Excel sheet, but the problem is it's manual, right? But if you have endpoint suites like McAfee, Python, PowerShell, I could pull out and be like, okay, in Active Directory or in asset management like SCCM, Altiris, here's all of our assets, 10,000. How many machines have McAfee? 9,980. Where did I get that from? I got that from the EPO database. It's just a database. Every tool can query a database. Okay, how many of them have the default rule set? 9,000. Okay, so we're missing 20 machines that don't have any coverage at all. 9,000 of them have the generic policy. the 980 or whatever the remaining, they fall into these categories. And that's one specific example, but where I'm going with that is with a little bit of scripting, I can build an automatic inventory that shows me this security coverage. Next gen firewall, clearly everything funnels through it to go out to the internet, but I have more specific rules under these policy IDs. And so I can measure that, and I can automatically put that on a daily, weekly, monthly report and be like, well, here's where we have data center specific controls for more critical assets. Here's where we have umbrella controls. Here's where we're completely missing coverage, because you will have some of those. EDR, but it's not deployed on these machines. Linux, it's a redheaded stepchild. It doesn't give as much protection because it's Linux. Sysmon for Linux is coming out soon. Audit D is out for free already. And whether it's open source, freeware, commercial, I don't care. But you start to lay that out. And I like scripting, so maybe that I'm a little biased on that aspect. But if you really want to know what your coverage and you want to measure, I almost feel like people who do KPIs and measurements, they're actually like savants, because in order to get all that, what do they have to do? They have to go get the data.
Yeah.
And you like, I don't care if it's like weird select statements with joins straight from a database, but you're basically scripting whether you're actually scripting or not. Reporting is hard, and anybody who says that it's not, they're wrong.
It is. But still, I feel that, you mentioned something. We were joking about what's the best way of measuring your efficacy, and we said, hey, just wait for a breach to happen. That's going to show you everything you need to do. And you mentioned that, well, that's where the budget shows up. So I think there's an element that we need to highlight, that in many cases, organizations, those that make the decisions, are not supportive of all of these things unless you show them the impact, right? And it is real clear. And when you go through a breach or you have a ransomware, incident, the impact is pretty clear, and that's why there is investment and more training or more resources after that. And that's, to be honest, that's why I like the purple teaming exercises, because it shows the impact right away.
How do you feel about doing self-assessments, but combining it with something like the Ponmon data? Like, for example, I had one client that what I did to kind of show them this, it was just a standard web server. They thought it was secure, but they allowed uploading a picture for their profile. And instead, I uploaded an ASP page and got a PowerShell shell. From there, I stole the service account because it was right there. And I had access to like 2 million unique patient records. But the way I portrayed it is I said, well, 2 million patient records times the Ponmon's data of $432 per unique record. This, if breach, would have cost you, boom. And it's like, well, we couldn't recover from that. It's like, so what you're telling me is the impact is so substantially high that not only should you fix the flaw I found, but you should probably also look at additional controls. Like for them, they would allow all nurses, all doctors to be able to dump every record all at once, but they never had a business need. And so what they did is they implemented a kind of the bank teller approach. Hey, I need $300. No problem. Here you go. Oh, I need $50,000. Let me get my manager. And there's kind of a multi-factor in there. And so the way that was communicated changed how they approached it. And that doesn't always have to be a third-party assessor like you and I coming in. I feel like that works really well because you're quantifying the impact using a subjective third-party report like the Ponmon Institute.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great way of putting numbers to these incidents. And another way, and I'm going back to ransomware because that's what we see on the news every single day. Many of these groups, they are looking at what's your revenue. That's a public information, and then demanding a ransom that is a percentage of that. Oh, so your revenue, it's I don't know, 50 billion. Well, we're gonna ask for a percentage of these, like I don't know, 5% of that or 10% of that. That's a lot of money, right? So you might be. We see many cases where the ransom is like $50 million more than that, right? Easily. So where that's a number that you can put in there, and sometimes even if it's not a number, just like showing what somebody can do, how far they can get, what type of information they can get out. Because now ransomware, for example, it's not just about the ransom, the money, not having access to the systems. It's also that they're going to exfiltrate the information before, and they're going to say, oh, if you do not pay, I'm going to make all of this information public, right? So how much does that cost in terms of loss of intellectual property, for example, customer trust? So one of the things you can do is, I like the idea of using compliance to your own advantage. You have to do your PCI audits, right? What do you do with this? You also do penetration testing. Many companies, they just are in the cycle of doing a yearly penetration test just for the sake of it, to say, hey, we did it. But what are you getting out of those pen tests? I see most organizations are getting very little value. So why don't you go and you ask the pen testing company that next year or this year, if you can do it, in addition to that or instead of that, you're going to go a step further and you're going to do more like a red teaming assessment. I tell you what, they're going to be thrilled, because pen testing, it's mostly boring, right? And it's going to be much more useful because you're going to convey impact with a specific scenario, and you're going to get more of these measurements of coverage, things you don't have, that will help you to move in the right direction.
Yep. And Oscar, I love your comment. I do think that's one way you could measure if something warrants additional controls, by the way. That's a very good process around that. Like, if we lose this asset or this process breaks, what's the impact of the business? And if it's detrimental, we need increased controls. Real quick, I want to throw one more thing out, and then we'll go to Francois' question. One of the things that I found really impactful for measuring is actually recording the attacks that are hitting you daily. Mm. Because some organizations, when you go up to them like, hey, we're being attacked all the time and the sky is falling, and they look at you like, yeah, you're just an InfoSec nerd. You just need to be quiet, because you're fidgeting, you're panicking, and I don't really think we're being attacked all the time. But the truth is, if you just generate a report from like your next gen firewall or your IDS or your CASB, and you're like, how many times did we get hit with password spraying? Did the SolarWinds IOCs, were they involved in our environment? Did that new Exchange attack come out? Oh, are we getting hit with any potential ransomware? And especially, like, I remember this was like my favorite one, like Drupalgeddon. A couple of years ago, right? Drupalgeddon, right? If you have a Drupal server, you don't patch within 7 hours, then you consider yourself owned. Well, we made the executive decision at the company to take our Drupal servers offline and make it where the only way you could access them was on a VPN. But what I also did, just because I was a nerd and I had too much time, is I put Drupal servers out on behind the NAT rules, because I wanted to see if we actually were going to get hit with Drupalgeddon. And we did. And so then the next day I went to management. It was like, hey, remember how we made that decision to pull our assets from the internet because the impact was going to be too high? Yeah, I don't know if that was a good call or not. Well, it was, because look, we actually got hit by it. And we gained tons of credibility, but it's a completely different situation or discussion when you say, I think this is occurring and we need this budget and we need this dollars, versus actually measuring it. Like, hey, that ransomware, this thing, we're vulnerable to it. See, I can prove it. Or we got hit with it, but we blocked it. Or like, you have EDR, or you have all these controls. Don't just let them protect you. Reflect on that back to management, because that's where you gain a lot of credibility.
Absolutely. I was thinking about that before. In the physical world, if you buy a security product, I'm thinking about a safe, for example, right? You get some specifications that says this safe will protect, your assets for this amount of time. If you apply up to this type of pressure and this type of heat, and so you get some measurements, and how much that can resist. Obviously, nothing is secure 100%, but you get data. In this world, I think we're too, used to saying, "Oh, how you doing? How secure are we?" Right? If the CISO or the The CEO comes to you and says, how secure are we? I think we're pretty good, right? I feel we're good. Now, that's not a good answer. We have data. We all have tons of data. There's a lot of data out there. I think Mitre shares a lot of this data through the Mitre framework. But as Justin is saying, you can get a lot of the data out of your own environment, and that's the best one to get. So build that visibility and measure that, right? Measure where you are, because you can give a better answer than I feel we're good.
Yeah. And Francois, to answer your question, if you pay ransom, you don't know that they won't publish your data anyway. You just hope.
You're dealing with criminals.
Technically, they're incentivized not to, because then if you expose that they released your data anyway, then the next company is less likely to pay, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But you're dealing with criminals, you don't know. Fuzzy, risk tolerance also deals with risk acceptance. And so I do think you're right. And I think that's something we need to stay like, it's going to cost me $250,000 to mitigate this risk, where if it actually impacts us, it's only $100,000. Accept the risk then. Like, it's more fun to mitigate, because I don't know if just mentally we're fixers. At least I know I am. That gets me in trouble in my marriage, by the way. Sometimes we just need to listen.
What are we talking about now, Justin?
I don't know.
I feel yeah.
But I mean, you're saying there, though, is you're actually, I don't know if I'd call it a measurement, but you're doing a calculation on whether you should accept the risk or not. And even if you present it to the business and say, I think we should mitigate it because here's the numbers, but if they're close enough, maybe we should just accept it. I think you're building trust within your organization, because they don't think you're trying to milk them for every dime they're willing to give you. So I do firmly believe in your approach.
Just one word of caution, Fuzzy. I would not accept the risk myself unless you are the business. I would get somebody else above you to accept that risk in writing. So when something goes wrong, it's like, you have that get free of jail card.
Yeah. And try to get one of those for your significant other too.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, I can't believe that we've been talking for an hour. This is too much fun.
Yeah.
And we still have so much to share. Maybe we should do another one. What do you guys think? Was this useful? You guys like this style? No slides, just chatting about the things that we feel that work, and we see that these things work.
Nobody's talking though.
I'll take that.
This one was horrible. Yes. And what is our next live stream? I don't remember what the topic is. It's not this.
I can't remember it either. But
Steven, flash the card, because I don't even know what it is.
Oh, there you go.
This will be a good one, because this one will probably go into open source versus commercial, because they're both right and they're both wrong at the same time. It's very much, it depends. But I think on this one, you and I have to come up with how to allocate a certain amount of money. And so we have to showcase how our mind works. And Ismael, I love working with Ismael because we're very different. And I think that actually acts as a devil's advocate, and a better solution comes from us working together. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, because you can spend $1 in many different ways. And I'm curious how, we're just going to show up. We don't, like, 5 minutes before this call, Ismael, like, what are we talking about?
So we have to build like a lab or something with an amount of dollars. Like, hey, you get $100 and I get $200. What can you do with this?
I think we both get the same amount. Come on, be nice. But I think we talk. I mean, maybe you and I could represent different companies. Like maybe I'm an organization with 2 people and you have 10, or like we could reflect on different companies, because I know when I deal with clients, it's like, oh, you're a single man shop. You shouldn't be doing open source because you can't maintain it.
I get that a lot. Yeah.
You have 5 people? Maybe you can do open source because you're spending a lot of money over here, but you're not doing anything with it. And why don't we bring that back, get you some more training? And I mean, I feel like there's definitely reasons you want commercial versus not. Like, is anybody here running pfSense as your corporate firewall?
I like pfSense.
I like pfSense, but I'm never going to use it in production. But if you were to say like an Elastic Stack, I do that all the time, but I also do highly customized versions of it. But most folks, they're like, I'm going to roll my own. And I'm like, go ahead. And I'll talk to you in 6 months.
But then ask how many people is running ELK, right? Open source, the Elastic Stack for various reasons. Or Snort, for example.
But then the question is, are you happy with how it's deployed? Because I think you'll get a different group.
Oh, this is going to be a great conversation. I love it.
Yeah. So I think, the budget one I'm really excited about, because I feel like I feel like we could talk easily 2 hours on that one. And I have a feeling we'll go over.
We can even do some whiteboarding. That would be fun.
I think that's maybe we should do like Microsoft Whiteboard or something, and we'll do a shared one.
And we do the different 2 companies, right? Same budget, 2 different companies, different use cases, and we do some whiteboarding on where you would invest the money on, right? I like that.
Maybe rather than doing Team Ismael and Team Justin, maybe you and I act like we work together and we're just having a conversation on, I think this, you think this, but we have to come to terms and agreement on where we spend the money.
I like that. Let's do that.
Let's do that. Steven, who's in the background, who handles all this stuff, we probably should do a test session before next time to see if we can have like an iPad joined as well, so that we can both draw.
Yep. Sounds great. Awesome. So do you have any conclusion about this live? Yes. So the conclusion is follow us on Twitter, right? So you can see it there. Follow us there because we're going to be sharing the next live stream. And, check out the tools that we mentioned today and think about that, right? How can you maybe emulate one specific attack, just one attack? Think about how to emulate that and get some metrics out of that. That's going to get you in the right mindset.
Yep. And if anybody has questions, like George, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, like antivirus for ARM, shoot that to us on Twitter or email us. I'm Justin at hasecuritysolutions.com, but we'll try to answer some of those offline. I've got other stuff I got to work on immediately, but I'll try to get back to you on that. And if anybody has any Elastic questions, because I see people interested in that, let me know. I can gladly help you with that, or we can watch it burn together.
All right, everybody.
All right.
Enjoy the rest of your days. Be safe. Bye-bye.